Hi, I'm Errol Lord, a member of the Love and Human Agency project, and today I'm talking to Andrea Westlund, who's an associate professor of philosophy and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thanks so much for talking with us. So let's just start off with you telling us a little bit about your work.
Sure, thank you very much. I work on a cluster of issues having to do primarily, I guess, with the concept of autonomy. Personal autonomy, what it is to be self-governing. But I'm also very interested in our relationships to one another and the way in which we deliberate together in the context of relationships of friendship and love. And I guess that might sound like a sort of unusual combination of interests. I'm interested both in individual autonomy and in things having to do with our ability to share agency, but in another way, I guess it's not all that surprising that those two things should be deeply linked or have implications for one another. So some of my work has had an emphasis on what it is to be self-governing and how to understand that concept, and some of my work has had more to do with how we sort of retain our autonomy within relationships of shared or collective decision-making.
Okay. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by self-governing and how that relates to agency and your conception of agency?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess, our attempts to understand agency at one sort of very fundamental level are attempts to understand, what it is to act or to do something as opposed to simply have something happen to you or in you, right? So there's a challenge in sort of figuring out what makes that difference. I tend to think of autonomous agency or as autonomy just as a sort of full-fledged version of agency. Agency sort of at its best, so to speak. So failing to be autonomous isn't, in my view, failing to be an agent, but I suppose you could say that it's failing to be all that an agent could be. It's falling short of a sort of ideal of agency. And I guess that ideal is one of leading a life that is governed by the agent herself rather than by something outside or sort of external to the agent.
Maybe it would be helpful if you could give some examples of non-ideal, non-autonomous agency and contrast that with the ideal that you have in mind, just so we have kind of more of a grip on the shades of agency on your view.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of examples, so maybe I'll start by talking about the ones that grabbed my attention or that interested me when I first started working on these issues. So I think many people sort of have the intuition that agents who have internalized oppressive social norms, for example, seem to be falling short of self-government or autonomy in some way. And when I first started thinking about these issues, I was puzzled by the fact that on many sort of mainstream, sort of dominant accounts of autonomy, it was very, very difficult to diagnose what might be wrong in those cases. In fact, cases of agents who appeared to be acting on oppressive norms that they had internalized sometimes came out looking as though they were perfectly autonomous or self-governed. Why is that? Well, on sort of one very sort of popular account of autonomy, a hierarchical account, very roughly speaking, what it is to be autonomous is to endorse the motives or desires or commitments or what have you on which you act. And it seems possible for someone to sort of endorse or at least, be satisfied with or not think that there's anything wrong with um, um, uh, motives or desires that they have because they've internalized some sort of oppressive social norm. So I started out by thinking there's something awry there. There's something that doesn't seem quite right about this sort of account of autonomy if it's giving us these results. So the social norm that I started out focusing on is a norm of deference, and I guess I was thinking of some, feminist discussions about, what sorts of behavioral norms are involved in our sort of cultural conceptions of femininity or ideals of femininity, and I focused on deference as one of as my sort of case study, and asked, what would be wrong with being perfectly deferential? What would be wrong in terms of what would be wrong, if anything, with your agency if you were perfectly deferential? And from one point of view, it might look like there's nothing wrong, because you might actually sort of adopt and endorse a policy of deferring to some other person. And if questioned, is this really how you want to be, you might think, yeah, of course it's how I want to be. This is, I've never wanted to be any other way. This is what I've learned is appropriate for me, or something like that. Maybe not very realistic, but at least, conceptually this seems possible. And yet, I've argued that we need sort of conceptual tools to distinguish between different forms or different kinds of deference. And I've put this in terms of answerability for one's action guiding commitments or one's motives or desires. And so there's a significant difference, I think, between an agent who holds herself answerable for her policy of deference by being willing to sort of entertain criticisms of it and being willing to attempt to sort of answer to those criticisms and revise or refine her policies as appropriate, and one who simply isn't, and who is not prepared or not willing or able to respond to such a challenge in any way that doesn't just sort of re-express the deference itself. So that's a little sort of synopsis of one corner of my research, I guess, and hopefully a sort of example of a kind of behavior that I think would count as non-autonomous.
Okay, so that was an example of the non-ideal, and I take it you were starting to get into talking about what you think the ideal is, but could you flesh out that a little bit more? So we have some idea what the non-ideal is. Now, could you say a little bit more about what you think characterizes the autonomous?
Right, okay. Yeah, so you're right. I actually did start, not just in this discussion, but actually in my own work in thinking about the non-ideal cases and trying to sort of diagnose what was going wrong there. But I have tried to sort of work from that to a clearer picture of what the ideal case would be like. And I certainly don't think that I've come anywhere close to sort of capturing all aspects or elements of that, but I do hope to have sort of identified and at least made a start at articulating one important element, which is that I think self-government or autonomous agency actually involves a form of what we might colloquially call open-mindedness, right? And I think, some of our popular ideals, or sort of popular as opposed to sort of philosophical ideals of autonomy, turn on something rather different. So there's this sort of stereotypical image of the autonomous agent as someone who is very independent, right? Who doesn't rely on others, who isn't unduly influenced or affected by others, who's sort of self-sufficient, right? And I think that that's sort of misleading, and that someone who is very independent in that substantive sense, may nonetheless have very little in the way of sort of reflective control over the ideals by which they sort of lead their lives or sort of guide their behavior. So someone who is substantively independent may lack autonomy every bit as much as someone who is very substantively dependent. What matters, I think, is the sort of self-relations that are in place. And to put it sort of roughly, I think the self-relations that need to be in place need to exhibit an appropriate amount of sort of open-mindedness, openness to critical perspectives on the one hand, but on the other hand, a willingness to sort of advocate for one's commitments and not simply let them go at the first sign, at the first sort of at the first hint of a challenge, right? So one has to be one's own advocate, but being an effective advocate for oneself means being sort of receptive to and appropriately responsive to external critical perspectives. So you can think of this as you can think of autonomy, or at least I've begun entertaining the idea that you can think of autonomy as a sort of virtue in that way, that you're sort of avoiding certain problematic excess or defect of open-mindedness.
The natural question to ask now is why you think that this notion of autonomy is what plays such an important role in agency at its best, as you put it before. So if you characterize it in terms of a virtue, there are plenty of virtues and plenty of kind of intellectual virtues that have a impact on practical matters in the way that the virtue that you were just describing seems to have. So why think that this is the thing that kind of makes being autonomous in this sense is what makes agency, what kind of caps it off, makes it the best that it can be?
Well, I guess I think that the idea of self-government is deeply connected to the idea of acting for reasons, but that we also can be sort of gripped by a conception of what reasons we have. So I think we need a vocabulary for distinguishing between cases in which we are governing our actions in light of those considerations that we take to be reasons, and cases in which we instead are captive, as it were, to a particular conception of what our reasons are. So what's the difference between governing ourselves in light of a conception of our reasons and being gripped by or captive to a particular conception of our reasons?
So if the idea is that properly self-governing agency has to avoid being gripped in this way, and that's the thing that makes it agency at its best, it would help to have some concrete example of being in the grip, in the right kind of way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one sort of well-known example, I think, is the example of the Milgram experiments, in which subjects were instructed to administer what appeared to them to be sort of painful electric shocks to another person, and it was clear to them, or at least it appeared to them, that this person was suffering and pleading that this not go on, but the sort of voice of authority was telling them that they must go on and that the experiment will not be successful. It can't proceed unless they go on, and many people, in fact, did go on much further, not just than we would expect them to, but than they themselves would have presumably expected to. And it looks there like they're in the grip of some sort of, they're in the grip of a norm having to do with authority and what kind of deference we owe to authority, right? it certainly looks as though they're not being self-governing in that case. So I think that's one sort of example of what it might look like to be in the grip of a norm or in the grip of a perception of something as a reason. Another example that I've worked with in some of my own papers, which I mentioned before, is a sort of norm of deference. And here I don't have a sort of actual case to refer to, but just a kind of hypothetical case, where if you ask someone who, say, is deferring to her spouse in a way that seems, excessive, that she seems to be overlooking her own interests, her own tastes, her own preferences, and sort of agreeing to, say, move wherever her spouse needs to move in order to further his career. And you ask her why she's doing so, and she answers simply by, again, referring to the needs and preferences and interests of the person to whom she's deferring. She's not really giving uptake to the question, she's just re-expressing her deference, right? As opposed to someone who will actually consider how to sort of integrate and how to sort of weigh her own interests and preferences in making a sort of collective decision about this sort of thing. If the only answer that's forthcoming is one that sort of re-expresses or reiterates the deference itself, it looks to me as though this person is sort of in the grip of a norm of deference and unable to think critically or actually entertain critical perspectives on that deference itself. Both of those examples, in a way, involve deference, although one is deference to an authority and one is deference to a sort of partner in a personal relationship. But they both sort of interest me for similar reasons, I guess.
Okay. Maybe to switch gears a little bit towards relationships a little bit. So how do you think that this kind of how do you think thinking about autonomy in the individual case kind of helps thinking about loving relationships or friendships or those kinds of relationships?
Well, I guess insofar as we think autonomy is an important ideal, and I understand that that's controversial, not everyone agrees about the extent to which it is important or how it's important and so on, but maybe, at least for sake of argument, let's say it's to some extent an important ideal. Some ways of thinking about love relationships and even some ideals of love start to look rather suspect to me. So in the philosophical literature on love, you find some examples of views on which the hallmark of a loving relationship is a kind of merger or union between the two parties. And when described in certain terms, it can sound like a wonderful thing. It's a way of trying to characterize, I think, the closeness and the depth of the relationship. But it's a way of characterizing that closeness or depth that I think can easily go sort of badly awry in ethical terms. So if you think of the parties as sort of the parties to a love relationship as sort of literally coming to share ends, we begin to sort of lose sight of the distinction. Well, I guess that goes without saying. If you think of them as literally sharing ends, you sort of lose sight of the distinction between them. This can lead, I think, to sort of inappropriate forms of sort of psychological domination or possessiveness on the one hand, or sort of self-effacement or deference on the other. And I think, we ought to be sort of striving for an ideal of love, an understanding of love relationships that manages to sort of characterize the closeness and intimacy that they involve without sort of inviting those sort of, or leaving room for those pathological forms, that, by which I mean without sort of making it look as though those pathological forms are just fine, right? This is a sort of way that, that love that there's nothing wrong with these sorts of cases. We need to be able to sort of say clearly, you know, where those cases have gone wrong, how this sort of departs from the ideal. So I guess in my own work, I've tried to articulate an ideal of what I call companion love. So I'm distinguishing between, I mean, there's many different forms of love. So the kind of love that I have in mind is the love that's involved in a sort of long-term companionate relationship between those who do have a romantic interest in one another, but also a kind of ongoing sort of friendship and a project of building a life together. And so I think the project of building a life together requires communication between two, what I call two individual practical perspectives. So each of us has a practical perspective, by which I mean a set of things that we take as a set of reasons, right? A set of practical reasons, things that we take as having normative weight that guide our decisions and actions, right? And in the context of a relationship of friendship or of companion love, which involves friendship, we share a sort of project of developing a joint practical perspective as a sort of product of a deliberation between, as a product of a joint deliberation, where we each draw on our sort of individual sort of practical perspective in an effort to sort of develop a conception of what we have reason to do as a couple or as a pair of friends or what have you.
As I understand your criticism of those union views, the views that say that in a loving relationship you kind of become another person comes into existence through the relationship. Your thought was that those views threaten autonomy in a certain kind of way. Mm-hmm. Could you do a little bit more to explain how the shared project doesn't threaten autonomy, the autonomy of the individual people?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think it is an important feature of this kind of love that the lover cares about the beloved for his or her own sake. And I think that part of what it is to care about the beloved for his or her own sake is to care about her reasons for adopting a shared set of reasons. So if it were the case that the beloved's reasons for adopting some consideration as a shared reason were simply that I mean, to give a different sort of example, simply that she were fatigued or bored or couldn't be bothered, this wouldn't, I think, strike one as as a good reason for entering into a sort of shared practical perspective. Other bad reasons would include, I think, just simply deferring or feeling psychologically dominated or that sort of thing. You want to actually be engaging the other person as an agent who has a sort of distinctive perspective, right? And not just sort of bringing them along willy-nilly into something that they aren't really sort of, that they can't really commit to. as an individual. So we're attempting to develop a shared perspective, but it has to be one that we're both sort of engaged in, and that in a way is sort of representative of some version of each of our individual sort of points of view. Obviously, I don't think that our individual points of view are static, and how we define our sort of shared perspective will actually sort of affect our individual points of view. But there's a sort of rapport, there's a sort of conversation going on between us, which I think sometimes involves a sort of willingness to sort of disagree, right? And work through disagreements in the process of coming up with something that we are comfortable sharing. At least provisionally, right? And this is a sort of, it's a sort of moving target. It's something that we revise in an ongoing way as we go along. And the active engagement of each party is crucial to it's actually being something that is shared, as opposed to it's being something that's simply imposed on one party or the other, or simply sort of accepted in a passive way.
Okay, so part of the idea is that loving someone for who they are involves respecting their autonomy, or...
Yeah, I think so. Right, that would be a much more economical way of putting it. Yeah,
so there's a way that's what explains why the kind of pathological versions are suspect.
Right.
Yeah, because they don't.
Yeah.
You can't really love the other person for who they are if the relationship is pathological in that way.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I guess turning now to another part of of our project, namely caring. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the relationship you see between caring and autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. I mean, this is something that I've started to think about more recently, I guess. I think that I accept, or at least I'm very sympathetic to, a certain way of thinking about what it is to have a practical perspective. So, to invoke again the term that I was using earlier, our practical perspective, our set of practical reasons, I think is at least in part constituted by what we care about, what we perceive as important. So what we perceive as important serves for us as a source of practical reasons. These practical reasons sort of jointly construct, or at least partially sort of constitute our practical perspective. And likewise, when we develop a shared practical perspective, we are developing concerns or cares that we share, sort of shared perceptions of certain things as important, other things as less important or not important. On the other hand, though, the same kind of worry that I raised earlier about the possibility of being in the grips of a certain kind of conception of our perception of reasons, I think applies here, that it is possible to be in the grips of a certain set of concerns or cares in a way that's intuitively not compatible with being fully self-governing. So the same question sort of arises. How do we distinguish between a case in which we are in the grips of a set of concerns or in the grips of a set of cares, and a case in which we are actually sort of self-governing in virtue of allowing ourselves to be guided by those cares? And so what I've most recently been trying to develop is a conception of care of the self, which sort of invokes a notion of care at a sort of second, or invokes the notion of caring about our own cares, or caring about our reasons. We care about ourselves in the practical sense, about our practical perspective or practical identity, insofar as we have a certain set of emotional and cognitive dispositions and other psychological states with respect, that take our particular cares and concerns as their object. The notion of self-care that I think matters distinctively to questions of autonomy is a rather distinctive form of self-care, and it might not sort of match up with sort of popular conceptions of what it is to care about oneself. For example, it isn't to be self-interested or to take a sort of prudential concern in one's future even, although that's certainly important, or to care about one's material or bodily well-being, but rather to care about the state of one's reasons, and whether the things that one perceives as reasons and treats as reasons are really well suited to playing that role. Can these considerations actually play a role in a viable justification of your actions, your choices and actions, or not? So caring about that, because it is, in fact, a way of caring about your own practical perspective or your practical orientation toward the world, is a way of caring about oneself, and it's a way of caring about oneself that matters crucially to your agency and your status as an autonomous agent. Precisely because I think that caring about oneself in that way means being sort of alive to the sorts of critical perspectives or challenges that we were discussing earlier. That if you care about the quality of your reasons as reasons, whether they really can play the justificatory role that you've assigned to them, caring about that means being sort of alive to critical challenges to to the way in which you treat those considerations. If you're not alive to critical challenges to the way in which you treat certain considerations, I don't think you really care about the quality of your reasons as reasons, right? You may just be in the grip of them. So again, I mean, it links back into the sort of notion of a sort of self-relation of holding yourself answerable for your action-guiding commitments or concerns. And now, I mean, again, the link to care here is that I'm now sort of taking on board a more specific notion of what it is to have a practical perspective or practical identity that is sort of built on the notion of care and the connection between our reasons and what we care about.
As I understand the picture, you think that you can understand the kind of open-mindedness that's connected with autonomy, or what is autonomy in your sense, in the terms of care. So ultimately you can understand autonomy in terms of this kind of self-care. Mm-hmm. So one natural question to ask is just for some more details about what you think this open-mindedness comes to. So one way that you put it before is that you have to be alive to criticism. Mm-hmm. You have to be kind of open to criticism. So I was wondering if you could explain in a little bit more detail kind of what that means in terms of caring, like in terms of what it is to care about your reasons, say. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to flesh out the picture a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are certain emotional responses involved that one who cares about her reasons will experience a kind of discomfort or distress or worry upon encountering signs or evidence that she's sort of misidentified certain things as important, right? And I mean, those aren't necessarily pleasant emotions, but they're crucial emotions, right? They help us to sort of get back on track when we've gone off track. So I think that being concerned about one's reasons does mean being vulnerable to certain emotional responses, and to being heartened and reassured and sort of energized by signs that you are on the right track, right? So we monitor and make judgments about when we need to revise our sense of what's important and what reasons we have, in part by, the form that monitoring takes is sort of being emotionally receptive to signs or evidence or indications that one's got it right or one's got it wrong, or that there may be sort of problems, or that problems have been resolved, and responding to those emotional reactions by not by sort of avoiding the situation and trying to sort of ignore it and let it go, make it go away, but by actually sort of taking on the responsibility of trying to sort of address the source of that reaction and figure out if the reaction's warranted or not.
Right. So you care about being a philosopher. What kind of emotional responses, or what kind of emotional dispositions do you need to have in order to care about your reasons that are generated by being a philosopher, say?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the kind of thing that I'm thinking of, so I mean, this may just be kind of off the main record here, but I mean, what I was trying to get at in the paper on self-care is just that, it matters to us whether whether we're sort of warranted in treating the things that we treat as important. And I mean, we have no way of sort of getting that apart from sort of working it through in dialogue with others. But if someone were to raise a consideration about, so suppose someone were to say, what's the point of pursuing an academic career, and sort of started to give examples of other things that would be sort of more worth my time or energy. If I sort of care about my cares, I'll find that a genuinely sort of challenging, and I'll find that a question that sort of warrants my attention and needs some kind of answer. And I may not be able to give the answer immediately, but I guess what I mean when I say we'll have emotional reactions is that we'll be emotionally engaged in that very question. I mean, it will matter to me whether I can develop a kind of answer to that question. Even if I'm not giving the answer sort of immediately in the course of a particular exchange with someone, it will matter to me that that there is an answer and that I can give that answer. And if I sort of repeatedly come up short, I might think, gee, I've got to rethink my commitments here. I have to sort of rethink my sense of what's important. So it's that kind of emotional engagement that I'm talking about, that, an inability to simply brush off questions as not mattering, and to sort of proceed with a sort of tunnel vision, right? We're vulnerable to challenges from the outside.
To shift gears a little bit again, I want to ask you a little bit about this notion of a narrative, which plays a role in some of your work. So, the first question is just, could you explain the notion and how you think it's relevant to these themes? So let's start with that.
Yeah. I've become interested recently in autobiographical narratives in particular, and the perspective that we take on our lives when we try to tell the story of our lives, or perhaps of some part of our lives. And so I'm interested both in the sort of nature of the perspective that we take on ourselves when we attempt to do that, and also in our reasons for doing it. I mean, why do we ever try to tell the story of our lives? So I'll say a little bit about both of those things, I guess. the perspective that we take on our lives when we try to tell the story of our lives is, I think, a very interesting one, because we're placed within a story that's still unfolding. And it's going to continue to unfold as long as we go on living. So when one actually sets out to, say, write a formal autobiography, not always. I mean, there are sort of more experimental forms of this, but often you find the projection of a kind of closure, the assignment of a kind of meaning to particular events and decisions in a life that may actually be vulnerable to sort of future contingency, right? So if things go in a certain way, the meaning that one has assigned to particular events or decisions in one's life might change, right? A different sort of description might become apt if things go in a certain way. So when we try to tell the story of our lives in that sense, we're taking this kind of, we're projecting ourselves into a perspective that we don't actually occupy and couldn't possibly occupy as long as we're still in the midst of living our lives. Why would we want to do that? What does this do for us? Well, I think that we do have a sort of need and a desire to sort of assign meaning to choices and actions in our lives. Sometimes that need arises from features of our interactions with others, right? So when others are puzzled or perplexed by what we've done, or perhaps they felt that we've wronged them, perhaps they feel that we've wronged them in some way, or that we've wronged someone else, or that, what have you. And they're trying to figure out what sort of moral reaction is appropriate. It's important to arrive at a kind of shared understanding of what we were actually up to, what reasons we had in mind when we did what we did. That'll make a difference to, whether I was actually behaving in a sort of inconsiderate or insulting way, or whether I wasn't, right? And so it'll make a difference to what sorts of moral reactions are appropriate, at least in some cases. So I think that's one reason why we attempt to sort of assign a particular, why we try to put some of these why we try to put some of these sort of choices within a narrative context, right, to illustrate their meaning, or at least what we take their meaning to be, and to sort of invite certain reactions, and to sort of attempt to sort of shape reactions in ways that we feel are appropriate. Others may offer a kind of counter-narrative if they think that the narrative framing that we've given distorts or fails to do justice to the situation, right? So there's a kind of exchange of narrative and counter-narrative as we try to work towards a kind of shared understanding of what's actually transpired and what our appropriate attitudes would be. I sort of worked my way into this sort of more general point that I want to make, which again links back to this sort of core idea that's animating a lot of my sort of research interests and a lot of my work, which is this idea of answerability. I've argued that being autonomous crucially involves holding ourselves answerable for the commitments or concerns that motivate our choices and actions. But sometimes the answers that we give appropriately take a narrative form, because the narrative form is crucial to sort of negotiating or figuring out the meaning of that particular choice or action.
Maybe say a little bit more about the relationships between autonomy, answerability, and narrative.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess to put it very briefly, and then I'll try and elaborate a little bit, I think answerability is required for autonomy, and I think that our answers, the answers that we give to external critical challenges, sometimes are best given in a narrative form. So, very briefly put, I think that that's how those three concepts are sort of linked together. The answers that we give, I think, take a narrative form in cases in which the right way of characterizing what we've done depends on what we did before and what we will go on to do afterwards. So there's a kind of narrative structure. We can't sort of accurately describe the action in isolation from its place in this sort of larger narrative context. So in those cases, I think we answer for ourselves to others by sort of telling, not necessarily the story of our whole lives, because it's sort of oversimplifying to think that any of us have one single unified story that spans, our lives from one end to the other, but that tells a story of a particular episode at least, or a particular segment of one's life.
One thing that I was struck by reading some of your work is that you use fiction a lot as examples usually. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you think fiction can help make progress and on these philosophical issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very good question, and probably one that I should be more sort of that I should reflect more on myself. I mean, the very honest answer is just that I find fiction incredibly psychologically illuminating, right? And I find it to be a rich source of sort of well-articulated and nuanced examples that are often more nuanced than the sorts of examples that philosophers typically come up with, which tend to be quite, sort of more stripped down and I guess narrowly conceived. There's a lot more sort of complexity and richness in the examples that you find in literary fiction. And I think that much fiction is actually quite philosophical. So I suppose I think there isn't maybe as sharp a divide between philosophy and fiction as one might suppose. I mean, they're different, to be sure, but there are shared interests in sort of deeply important questions about human agency that the writers of fiction are approaching in one way and through one sort of medium, and that philosophers are approaching in another way and through another sort of medium. And they can draw on each other in deeply enriching ways, I think. I just know that in my own work I sometimes find fiction to be very sort of, not just, enjoyable, but very sort of intellectually stimulating. And it seems to me to help me get a better sort of grasp on or insight into some of the philosophical problems that I'm working on.
Okay. So some viewers might be curious, I know I'm curious, whether you have any particular pieces of fiction that you think are kind of paradigms of this kind of thing.
Oh, well, I won't try and answer that sort of in general, but just with respect to the particular project on narrative and agency that I'm working on right now, in one of my papers I develop an extended example from Wally Lamb's novel, I Know This Much Is True, which contains a sort of narrative within a narrative, an autobiographical narrative within a sort of autobiographical narrative. And one thing that I find very interesting about the use of autobiography in that particular novel is that it clearly has a sort of that the character's attempt to narrate his own life plays a crucial role in sort of moral learning or moral education in a sort of deepening of his own understanding, and actually a sort of radical change in his own understanding of the significance of crucial events in his life. So the very act of narrating, of telling his story, I don't want to ruin the novel for anyone who may not have read it, but the very act of telling his story helps him to see how deeply confused he's been about what some of his own concerns and guiding ideals are. So it's a destabilizing exercise, and I found that to be a sort of quite illuminating idea, and that rang true to me, that telling our own stories can actually, we can surprise ourselves and learn a lot from attempting to tell our own stories.
Okay, so now I'll put my psychologist hat on and ask a question from that point of view. So some psychologists or biologists or hard scientists in general might think that we can explain all of what needs to be explained about human behavior just by doing psychology or biology or some combination of the hard sciences. So I was wondering what you think philosophy has to add to the study of human behavior, broadly construed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things I'd like to say about that. One is that, in order to study some feature of human behavior empirically, we need to know, I guess, what it is that we're actually attempting to we need to know what it is that we're attempting to examine. We have to have a sort of clear conception of what it is that we're investigating. And I think that at least some of the work that philosophers do is in sort of challenging and probing the sort of limits of, maybe not the limits, but challenging and probing our the way in which we construct certain questions and the way in which we think about the very subject matter of our empirical investigations. And I guess, one example of this that's sort of, that would be sort of directly linked to this interest in autonomy and caring relationships would be, again, thinking back to that sort of popular ideal or stereotype of autonomy. It's very tempting maybe to think that what autonomy is a matter of sort of substantive independence from other people. And that if we're sort of studying, psychological traits that are relevant to autonomy, if we're thinking of autonomy in those terms, it's going to sort of affect our sort of sense of, what psychological traits are relevant to that. But we shouldn't take for granted that autonomy is really about being independent from other people, or that autonomy doesn't involve sort of forms of relationality or forms of care. So I guess this is just a sort of roundabout way of saying we need to sort of be reflective and clear about, what questions we're asking and what sort of traits and forms of behavior are sort of relevant to those questions, and how to sort of put it together in illuminating ways. And I think that the skills that philosophers bring to the table are not skills that are unique to philosophers. They're sort of human skills. The ability to sort of diagnose the source of disagreements about what we're studying, or how to frame the question. The ability to sort of draw clarifying distinctions, right? The ability to to sort of track the implications for one way of framing the problem will have for other problems, and ways of framing those problems. These aren't skills that are unique to some sort of subset of people, namely philosophers, but they're skills that philosophers are, this is their sort of daily bread and butter, so to speak. This is what philosophers are trained in doing. And so I think bringing that unique skill set to the table is very useful in interdisciplinary settings, as well as in more sort of traditionally, the pursuit of more sort of traditionally philosophical problems. Also, I think it's useful in the practical or public field, bringing philosophy into public policy. Again, that particular skill set, this way of sort of approaching problems and diagnosing and getting clear about the source of disagreement, what it is that people are really disagreeing about, might not be what on the surface appears to be the main issue, right? And I think this can be a very kind of useful form of engagement or involvement in more practical questions as well.
Thank you so much. This was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.